I think it's true to say that modern aviation is the sum of all its previous experiences, and nowhere is this more evident than in the industry's approach towards safety and the perpetual need and desire to learn from past mistakes. It's an industry not afraid to examine and self-evaluate, to search for cause and to implement change so that moving forward air transportation can be as safe and reliable as it possibly can be. But with this honest self-reflection comes painful lessons of events and actions which should not, or very easily may not have happened at all. Lessons of technical or procedural deficiency, discovery of inadequate knowledge or substandard training, or indeed the fallibility of the human being and our fragile involvement. This episode provides insight into one such lesson and highlights in the clearest manner possible the implications and devastating consequences of ambiguity in a complex system. This is the complete story of Dan-Air Flight 1008. Today's date is April 25th, 1980. At 0922 local, Dan-Air Flight 1008 will lift off from Manchester Airport in the north of England, bound for the Spanish island of Tenerife, some 4.5 hours flying time to the south. On board will be 138 holidaymakers and a crew complement of 8, captain, first officer, flight engineer and 5 cabin crew. The flight will be operated by a Boeing 727-100 series aircraft, a trijet common at the time, having been manufactured in 1966. In command will be Captain Arthur Whelan, age 51. His total experience will amount to almost 15,300 hours, just over 1,900 of which will have been acquired on the 727. His first officer will be 34-year-old Michael Firth. His experience will amount to just under 3,500 hours, nearly 620 of which will have been acquired on type. Seated behind the 2 pilots will be flight engineer Raymond Carey, also 34 years of age. He will have amassed just over 3,300 hours of total time. Between them, they've collectively operated into Tenerife on more than 70 previous occasions. Situated to the northeast of the island, 7 kilometres to the west of its principal town Santa Cruz, Tenerife North, formerly known as Los Rodeos, will forever be associated with the ground collision of 2 fully laden 747s, the worst aviation disaster in history, and the resultant loss of 583 lives, which occurred only 3 years previously. On this April afternoon, however, in only a few short hours, an aviation tragedy will once again strike the island. Situated as it is at over 2,000 feet above mean sea level, the airport of Tenerife North lies across a saddle between 2 mountain groups. Terrain to both the east and the west of the field slopes steeply down to the sea, with mountains to the northeast rising to 3,360 feet within 9 kilometres, and to the southwest 7,630 feet within 7.5 kilometres. 35 kilometres to the southwest, the terrain rises rapidly to the volcanic peak of Mount Mayday at 12,198 feet above sea level. The island is completely exposed to the winds of the Atlantic, which at times can be strong to gale force, often giving our eyes to strong turbulence on approach due to the proximity of the high terrain. Often cloud covered, the northwest end of the runway may sometimes have a relatively low cloud base and poor visibility caused by the winds blowing up off the sea, while at the same time the reciprocal end may be completely clear. In short, Tenerife North is approached with caution by crews who routinely visit. By 1964, the airport's single runway, orientated southeast-northwest, and identified as 1230, had been stretched to 3,000 metres or just over 9,800 feet, in order to accommodate the new generation of larger jet transports visiting the island. New navigation aids were installed and the apron was expanded to provide more parking spaces. Later, in 1971, with the prospect of even larger aircraft using the airport, most notably the Boeing 747, the runway was reinforced and an ILS instrument landing system was installed for approaches onto the 30 end. To facilitate traffic flow management, 2 holding patterns were depicted in the local area. Centred on the Tenerife North VOR, Tango Foxtrot November, a left-hand pattern was published establishing inbound on the 045 degree radial. Further to the south and centred on the Tango X-ray locator beacon was depicted a second right-hand pattern established inbound on the ILS localizer for runway 30. Notable by their absence were any published holding patterns to the west of the airport in order to facilitate traffic flow onto runway 12. The reason for this, in fact, was fairly straightforward. As the prevailing winds across the island blow from a westerly direction, runway 30 was nominated the active runway at Tenerife North for the vast majority of the time. Indeed, the failure to install a similar ILS precision approach onto the 12 end of the runway is indicative of its infrequent use. However, as luck would have it, the afternoon of April 25th proved to be just one such infrequent occasion, with aircraft preparing to arrive and depart, being informed that due to reported and forecast winds, runway 12 was indeed the active. Approximately 35 minutes before the accident, at 12:45 Zulu, control of Dan-Air 1008 will be transferred from the area controller at Las Palmas Control Center to the more local approach controller for Tenerife North. From the time of this handover, the approach controller will be in contact with only 2 other aircraft apart from Dan-Air 1008. The first some distance ahead of 1008 and who will inadvertently play a significant part in this afternoon's events will be a Fokker F-27, also inbound for landing at Tenerife with the call sign Iberia 711. The other will be a Hapag-Lloyd 542, a scheduled departure which will ultimately play no part in the subsequent sequence of events. Tasked with overseeing the 727's approach into Tenerife North this afternoon will be 34-year-old air traffic controller Justo Jamin. What will be of huge significance is that due to the non-availability of radar at the airfield, Jamin will be forced to manage traffic movements procedurally. What this actually means is that he will not have the benefit of observing traffic movements on a conventional radar screen. Rather, he will instruct each aircraft in turn to fly along a predetermined route from one specific navigation aid to the next, with associated descent clearances being issued as the aircraft progresses beyond each of the navigation aids in turn. These descent clearances will be in line with published navigation charts and ensure adequate terrain clearance over the specific segment of the route being flown. In having no real-time radar presentation at his disposal, Jamin's situational awareness as to where each of the aircraft are at any given time will rely completely on each of the aircraft broadcasting a position report, indicating their respective progress as they overfly the navigation aids along the route. Although not exactly best industry practice, procedural controlling without the aid of a radar is nonetheless still safe, while at the same time acknowledging an increased level of workload being generated for both the crew and especially the controller. As Iberia 711 approaches the Tenerife North VOR, flying at a slower airspeed than the 727 behind, unbeknownst to Jamin, separation between it and the Dan-Air flight will quickly begin to erode. His intention with regard to the Iberian aircraft will be to have it fly directly overhead the Tenerife North VOR station, and thereafter leave to the southwest on the 255 radial for a distance of 6 nautical miles until it overflies the non-directional beacon Foxtrot Papa, this beacon being specifically located to assist arriving aircraft making the instrument approach to the easterly runway 12. Navigating away from the Foxtrot Papa beacon, 711 will proceed northwest on a track over the ground of 302 degrees until just off the coastline, where it will commence a track reversal procedure, allowing it to finally align with the extended centerline of the landing runway. As the minimum altitude to which aircraft can be descended having passed the Tenerife North VOR is 5,000 feet, this track reversal procedure will not only allow for alignment with the landing runway, but will also facilitate the necessary distance to descend from 5,000 feet to the airport elevation, which in the case of Tenerife North is 2,073 feet above sea level. Once established inbound on a track of 122 degrees, the instrument approach for runway 12 will allow for a descent 2,920 feet above sea level, or approximately 850 feet above the airport elevation. Descent below this altitude may only be accomplished once the pilot has visual contact with the landing runway, and is in a position to guarantee his own terrain separation. If having descended to this value, which is the published minimum descent altitude for the approach, visual acquisition of the landing runway is not achieved, then as the aircraft passes overhead the Foxtrot Papa beacon, the approach must be discontinued and the aircraft either positioned for another approach or indeed diverted to an alternate airfield. At 13, 14 and 28 seconds Zulu, 6 minutes and 50 seconds before impact, First Officer Firth will contact Tenerife approach. Tenerife, good morning, Dan-Air 1008. The approach controller in response will reply, Dan-Air 1008 Tenerife, go ahead. Firth will continue by providing Camine with an update on their progress and current position. Good morning, sir. Level at 110, 14 miles to Tango Foxtrot, November. At this exact moment, the 727 will be 14 miles north of the Tango Fox November navigation beacon. Level at flight level 110, the approximate equivalent of 11,000 feet, with an indicated airspeed of near 280 knots or 520 kilometers per hour. The follow-up clearance issued by Camine will be routine and issued without hesitation. Dan-Air 1008 cleared to the Foxtrot Papa beacon via Tango Foxtrot November, flight level 110, expect runway 12, no delay. With this clearance, Camine will instruct 1008 to follow the same route as has been previously given to Iberia 711, namely to track outbound on the 255 radial having passed overhead the Tenerife North navigation beacon, proceeding en route to the Foxtrot Papa beacon, from which the instrument approach to runway 12 will commence. Significantly, he will inform the crew of Dan-Air 1008 that they should expect no inbound delay, clearly creating the impression in their minds that the approach will continue uninterrupted. At 13, 14 and 56 seconds Zulu, 6 minutes and 23 seconds before impact, 1008 will acknowledge receipt of the clearance and make a request of Camine for the latest weather report from the airfield itself. Roger, cleared to the Fox Papa via Tango Fox November, runway 12. Can we copy the weather? Camine will reply, OK, runway in use 12 and wind 120 at 5 knots, visibility 6 kilometers. Cloud, few at 400, scattered at 800, few at 1200, November Hotel 1013, temperature 16, dew point 11, and drizzle. 1008 will acknowledge the report and request the QFE for runway 12. Although no longer common across the industry, in the day many operators chose to set QFE as the altimeter's predator datum for takeoff and landing, whereas reference to the QNH datum will have the aircraft altimeter indicate the runway's height above sea level at touchdown. With the QFE datum being used, the altimeter would instead actually read 0 with the aircraft on the ground. The logic in many respects was sound. With QFE set, the altimeter would always indicate the aircraft's height above the runway. What it wouldn't do, however, is give a direct correlation of the aircraft's height relative to any other terrain in the area, as all topographical charts by definition depict elevation as height above sea level only. Therefore, in order to appreciate one's height in relation to charted terrain in the area, the altimeter needs to be configured to the same sea level datum, namely QNH. Thus it was largely for this reason the practice of using QFE for takeoff and landing largely diminished over the years in favour of what was deemed to be the safer alternative of setting QNH. Having obviously missed 1008's request, Camine will turn his attention back to the Iberia flight ahead of Dan-Air. Iberia 711 level. He would be anxious to get an update from the Spanish aircraft ahead, as Dan-Air's ability to descend below flight level 110 will be predicated on its progress. 711 will report that they have proceeded beyond the Tenerife North navigation beacon, have established in the 255 radial towards Foxtrot Papa, and that they are now maintaining 5,000 feet, the lowest altitude attainable until commencing final ascent with the instrument procedure for runway 12. Iberia 711, we are past the VOR and have left 6. We are now 5,000 maintaining. Knowing this, Camine can now safely descend Dan-Air 1008 below its current altitude of flight level 110. Dan-Air 1008, descend and maintain flight level 60. First Officer Firth will acknowledge. Again, come in will query 1008 as to its DME or distance from the Tenerife North VOR beacon, as he continues to monitor their progress in relation to the aircraft ahead. Firth will report the 727's current position as being 7 miles north of the VOR beacon, and again request the latest QFE figure for runway 12. We're reading 7 DME Tango Fox November and requesting QFE please. Kameen will this time pass the requested information as being 943 millibars, and again Firth will acknowledge. The reason for the low pressure reading lies in the fact that, as already mentioned, the QFE value is a pressure reading from the landing runway threshold itself, and in the case of Tenerife North Airport, this is some 2,000 feet plus above sea level, with a 1 millibar reduction in pressure being registered for every 30-foot increase in altitude above sea level. With just 4 minutes to impact, Captain Whelan will ask his FO to tune the ILS on his navigation set. Although runway 12 is not configured for an ILS approach, the captain's intention will be to use the back course of the runway 30 localizer to provide a rudimentary backup of lateral guidance, in addition to information from the primary navigation source for the approach, that being the Foxtrot Papa beacon itself. You can put the ILS on your side. We might get it on the back beam for a lead-in. There will be no further dialogue between Dan-Air 1008 and the Tenerife approach controller until the aircraft reports that it has passed the Tenerife North VOR. However, in what will be an act of grave significance, the cockpit voice recorder will record the fact that First Officer Firth will belatedly communicate their passing the beacon some 33 seconds after the event, at 13, 18 and 48 seconds Zulu. The reason for their delayed transmission will never be determined, as the frequency for the most part will remain uncongested, with only a brief 10-second exchange being recorded between the controller and the departing Hapag-Lloyd flight. The consequences of the late call will, however, have a detrimental effect on cockpit workload. As separation between the two aircraft rapidly closes, any remaining opportunity to remedy the situation is fast becoming time critical. In fact, from the time the aircraft will report its position as 7 nautical miles north of the VOR beacon, approximately 4 minutes and 50 seconds prior to impact, the aircraft's speed, rather than reduce in preparation for the approach, will actually slowly increase. Although instructed to fly directly overhead the Tango Fox November beacon, Dan-Air 1008 will actually pass just under a mile to the east, and although still some 4,000 feet above the Iberian F-27, is travelling over the ground at a significantly faster speed, fast enough that its resultant radius of turn will not allow it to ever establish on the assigned outbound radial of 255 degrees towards the Foxtrot Papa beacon. Despite this, it will appear that the crew of Dan-Air 1008 at this moment will be situationally aware as to where they currently are and where they need to go next. Just about to go overhead, going for 255 out of here. While this exchange between Captain Whelan and First Officer Firth is ongoing, the aircraft will commence a wide turn to the right onto a heading of 263 degrees as it attempts to establish on the 255 radial outbound from the VOR. However, as mentioned, the radius of turn will not facilitate such a manoeuvre, and the aircraft will constantly remain south of the intended radial, making overflight of the Foxtrot Papa beacon completely impossible. At about this time, Kameen will engage in a brief conversation with the Hapag-Lloyd flight as it approaches the departure runway. In his mind, events are unfolding as intended, and to a large extent it's business as usual. As stated at 13, 18 and 48 seconds Zulu, an inexplicable 33 seconds after passing a beam the Tango Fox November beacon, Firth reports their position. Dan-Air 1008 has just passed the Tango Foxtrot November heading to Fox Papa. Finally realising that separation is becoming an issue, Kameen will make a belated attempt to rectify the developing situation. Roger, the standard holding over Fox Papa is inbound heading 150. Turn to the left, call you back shortly. Not having the benefit of radar, Kameen will believe that 1008 has just passed the Tenerife North beacon and is subsequently established in the 255 radial towards Fox Papa as instructed. Still with 1,000 feet vertical separation between the two aircraft, he will decide to place 1008 into an improvised holding pattern where it will wait until Iberia 711 has completed its approach onto runway 12. He will decide to anchor the holding pattern on the Foxtrot Papa navigation beacon itself, with the aircraft to fly left-hand turns in an anti-clockwise direction, with the inbound leg to the beacon defined as 150 degrees. In retrospect, however, his instructions will be ambiguous, and regrettably, the confusion they will cause in the cockpit of the 727 will never be resolved, with devastating consequences for all those on board. For the Dan-Air crew, their workload will increase almost instantaneously. Not physical workload per se, although admittedly effort will be required in getting the aircraft into the correct holding pattern, but cognitive workload. Despite Kameen referring to the hold as standard, in reality this is not the case, and therein will lie the difficulty for Captain Whelan and his crew. By definition, it is reasonable for a crew to be able to make reference to a navigational chart in order to study and orientate themselves with the proposed hold. But due to the relative infrequent usage of runway 12, there was actually no published hold located at the Fox Papa beacon. This in itself is not totally unheard of, and ATC do on occasion create improvised holding procedures. However, in such cases the inbound leg would more commonly be aligned with the relative environment piece, for example the extended runway centerline, so that the aircraft could seamlessly transition from the hold to the approach procedure at the appropriate time. But this confusingly was not the case at hand. Kameen's choice of 150 degrees inbound will appear to be arbitrary and not orientated with the landing runway in any meaningful way. Furthermore, standard holds, again by definition, are right-hand patterns, clockwise patterns, which this was not. On receipt of the clearance, Firth will immediately acknowledge it. Roger, Dan-Air 1008. Much will be subsequently made by Spanish investigators of Firth's failure to read back the clearance in full in order to confirm the accuracy of what he had heard. But the reality will be that in 1980 such a definitive readback is not a regulatory requirement, and as such Firth is guilty of no procedural oversight. Over the next 56 seconds, there were no transmissions between the aircraft and the approach controller, or indeed between the approach controller and any other aircraft. However, in the cockpit of the 727, all three crew members on the flight deck will become increasingly more involved in a discussion as to what is actually being asked of them. Inbound 150 to your left. 150 left, yeah. That's an odd sort of one. With the aircraft still descending, Whelan will indicate that they are now within 1,000 feet of the last cleared level, flight level 60, and both Firth and Carey will acknowledge. No, I'm not. Suppose it's alright. I'll just turn straight around left onto 150 when I go overhead then. Yeah. This single statement will be the turning point for all those on board. From the observer's perspective, it will now become obvious that what Captain Whelan has interpreted from Kameen's instruction is that he is to turn his aircraft left onto a heading of 150 once overhead the beacon, and Firth's reply will only act to endorse that viewpoint. Whelan will comprehend the fact that they are fast approaching the Foxtrot Papa beacon, and that in fact, due to their speed and radius of turn, they will fail to overfly it. The only thing is we're just about to miss it. It's too close. Given that the holding pattern will be anchored on the Fox Papa beacon, Firth diverts his attention momentarily to tune both radio receivers to the Foxtrot Papa frequency. Would you like the other one on the Foxtrot Papa as well for this? If you put them both on as we're going to hold, yeah. That's the Fox Papa now? Yep. Given the ambiguity of Cameen's instruction and the time pressure involved, Whelan and his crew will struggle to orientate their collective cognitive model with the environment outside. Critically, they will only seek clarification and endorsement from each other rather than from Cameen himself. And in so doing, their interpretation of Cameen's instruction will take Dan-Air 1008 somewhere no one could have expected. An explanation of what exactly is about to happen next will focus largely on this literal interpretation of the instruction Whelan has heard. With much uncertainty as to what exactly will be expected of him and his crew, he will focus on what he believes he does know for sure. A review of Command's instruction will demonstrate that he will endeavour to provide the crew of 1008 with as much information as possible to facilitate their entry into and maintenance of the improvised holding pattern. He will provide the necessary inbound heading, namely 150 degrees, and the direction of all turns once established. However, be the reason linguistic in nature or stress related, what will be intended as information to the crew, that being turns to the left, will actually be communicated as turn to the left. The inadvertent dropping of a single S will change the plural to the singular, and information, at least in the mind of Captain Whelan, to instruction. As Iberia 711 continues with its approach, its involvement in the dramatic events surrounding Dan-Air 1008 will largely conclude. As such, in the interest of clarity, its track over the ground will now no longer be depicted. At approximately 13:19 Zulu, about 2 minutes before impact, 1008 will have progressed to a point almost overhead the threshold of runway 30, while descending through 7,000 feet and maintaining a heading of 263 degrees magnetic. About 30 seconds later, still maintaining the same heading and speed, 1008 will start to level at flight level 60. Firth immediately informs the approach controller. Dan-Air 1008 is the Foxtrot Papa level at 60 taking up the hold, and Cameen will acknowledge. His position report will be inaccurate, however, as 1008, similar to its transit of the Tenerife North beacon beforehand, will again not fly directly overhead, but rather a beam and slightly to the south of the Foxtrot Papa. Cameen, however, knowing no better, will be convinced that the separation issue has been resolved, and that 1008 will now be commencing a turn to the northwest in order to establish in the holding pattern. But this will turn out to be a false assumption on his part, as Whelan will continue to maintain the aircraft wings level. Inexplicably, despite having previously stated his intention to turn onto a heading of 150 degrees once overhead the Fox Papa, Whelan will hold the 727 steady on its current heading of 263 degrees for a further 20 seconds. In that short time frame, the aircraft will have covered a further 2 nautical miles, or approximately 3.7 kilometres. Mindful of the fact that the aircraft is not being monitored on radar, and the fact that it is not following a prescribed track which has been specifically examined for adequate terrain clearance, at 6,000 feet, Whelan is now taking his aircraft into a sector where the minimum safe altitude which is stipulated in order to guarantee clearance from all obstacles in the area is set at 14,500. In other words, the 727 will now be flying blind, in cloud, at an altitude where terrain clearance can no longer be assured. With just 60 seconds to impact, Whelan commences the belated left turn onto a heading of 150, in the belief that he is complying with the controller's instructions. Following a comment by the flight engineer, "That's the fuel," which will appear to relate to his own specific duties, Firth will continue to express vague doubts and reservations to his captain. "Bloody strange hold, isn't it?" Whelan will reply, "Yes, isn't parallel with the runway or anything." However, the collective confusion will not influence Whelan to the point where he alters his intended course of action, and thus the left turn to the south continues. In the few seconds that follow, Firth will again express further doubts. This time Carey will join in. Presumably referring to one of their navigation documents, he will ask Carey the question, "It's that way, isn't it?" Followed by further interaction between the two. "That is a 3, isn't it?" "That is a 3, isn't it?" "Yes, well, the hole's going to be here, isn't it?" Firth's comments will clearly indicate a level of uncertainty about the manoeuvre which is being flown. However, the subsequent investigation will find it difficult to definitively place the flight engineer's comments in context. While this discussion is ongoing, Kameen will ask Iberia 711 to advise when they have vacated 5,000 feet. They will respond immediately that they have left 5,000 and are in the turn to establish inbound on the extended centerline for runway 12. "We have vacated 5,000 and are in the procedure turn." In response, Kameen will immediately contact 1008. Dan-Air 1008 re-cleared to 5,000 feet on Quebec Fox Echo and Quebec November Hotel. The subsequent investigation will, however, be critical of the manner in which this particular clearance is issued, as QFE and QNH are two completely different datum points from which to establish true altitude. However, the crew acknowledged the message, read back the information, and subsequently did use the correct QNH datum. In his own mind, Kameen will believe that 1008 is now heading out to sea while flying the manoeuvre which will see it established in his improvised holding pattern. In truth, however, 1008 is heading further and further inland, in cloud, with no external visual reference, and now descending so as to make terrain clearance even more precarious. A few seconds after acknowledging the reclearance, Whelan, who will be quiet and not particularly vocal by nature, will appear to be still attempting to reconcile the previous holding instructions. In his mind, something is still not right. Hey, they did say it was 150 inbound. With less than 50 seconds remaining to impact, while reviewing Kameen's instructions one more time, he will finally come to the haunting realization that the maneuver he is committed to will actually take him on a heading of 150 degrees away from the Foxtrot Papa beacon, whereas the information he had been given referred to an inbound heading in the hold of 150 degrees to the Foxtrot Papa. Yet again, confusion reigns in the 727's cockpit as the intercommunication between Whelan and Firth again shifts to the holding instructions. In answer to the captain's previous interrogative, Firth will reply, "Inbound, yeah." That's, I don't like that. They want us to keep going round more, don't they? With a mere 28 seconds remaining to impact, the discussion will be interrupted by the sudden activation of the ground proximity warning system.
Terrain, pull up, Terrain, pull up.
Stunned into action, Captain Whelan will immediately break off the turn to the left and remark, "Overshoot, he's taken us around to the high ground." As Whelan applies power, he will call to his flight engineer, instructing him to watch my EPRs, a direction aimed at ensuring that the maximum power indications will not be exceeded. He will initiate a sharp right turn in the belief that such a track reversal will take him away from the terrain, and continue to maintain this course of action despite his first officer's suggestion that perhaps a more effective escape path would actually be to tighten the left-hand turn rather than reverse it. I suggest a heading of 122 actually, and take us through the overshoot. It will be surmised in the subsequent investigation that Firth's situational awareness of exactly where the aircraft was may well have been more accurate than Whelan's, due in part possibly to his previous dialogue with Carey and their coincidental examination of their onboard navigation charts while attempting to reconcile the previously issued holding instructions. Gary will also voice his concern from the flight engineers panel. Let's get out of here. In a cruel twist of fate, 10 seconds after its activation, the GPWS will silence, just as abruptly as it had started. Not because of Whelan's abrupt turn to the right, although he'll be convinced to the contrary, but because in making this right-hand turn, the aircraft will briefly fly over a valley, the result of which is that the aircraft will see the immediate threat disappear. Again, the captain will repeat, "He's taking us round to high ground." Firth will not repeat his earlier suggestion, but rather simply acknowledge Whelan's remarks. A mere 4 seconds before impact, Whelan himself will make a transmission to the approach controller. Dan-Air 1008, we've had a ground proximity warning. Coincidental with Whelan's call to ATC, Carey will attempt to draw his attention to the excessive bank angle being flown. Bank angle, bank angle. Company procedures will require the flight engineer to alert the pilots whenever the bank angle exceeds 30 degrees, and although the aircraft will be exceeding this value for more than 15 seconds before he raises the alert, the reason is most probably due to his adjustment of the engine thrust settings as per the captain's command. These will be the last words recorded on the cockpit voice recorder of Dan-Air Flight 1008. The aircraft impacted the ridge of a mountain the locals call El Diablo, or the Little Devil, at an altitude of 5,450 feet above sea level, on a heading of 253 degrees magnetic, with a speed of 258 knots, or 478 kilometers per hour. Gamin will hear the transmission relating to a ground proximity warning, but will be unsure as to its origin. Station calling? A brief exchange will follow between Gamin and Iberia 711 as it approaches the airfield for landing, before he turns his attention back to the 727. Dan-Air 1008, your position in the holding. Dan-Air 1008, Tenerife, request your position in the holding. But there will be no reply. Dan-Air 1008 has been lost, along with all 146 souls on board. The mountainous impact site lay in a magnetic bearing of 222 degrees from the threshold of runway 12, at a distance of 11.5 kilometres and an altitude of 5,450 feet above sea level, some 125 feet below the summit. Impact occurred obliquely on a slope which inclines 30 degrees to the horizontal and forms one side of a valley whose floor lies approximately 4,300 feet above mean sea level, running from northwest to southeast, with the opposite side of the valley being formed by a lesser peak rising to 4,800 feet. The accident site was observed to be in a relatively broad, clear zone, immediately before a densely wooded area. A few small trees were struck immediately before ground contact, with evidence of the right wingtip grazing a number of rocks. Wreckage distribution indicated that much of the aircraft broke up at initial impact, but there were signs that a large section of the cabin from aft of the wing, possibly with the empennage attached, remained relatively intact and travelled several hundreds of metres before breaking up and starting a secondary wreckage trail, which included passenger seats and their occupants. The main wreckage trail was approximately 1,200 feet long across the slope, rising some 200 feet above the initial impact site. At its maximum, the debris field extended to 600 feet wide, with a significant number of larger fragments having rolled a considerable distance downhill from the initial point of impact. In general, the early part of the main trail included a high proportion of wing structure and engines, the left-hand main landing gear, the tips of the horizontal stabilizers and elevators, and some flight deck components. Following the trail in the direction of the mountain's summit was found additional flight deck components, passenger baggage, the nose landing gear, smaller fuselage parts, parts of the aircraft's wings and engines, and a large portion of the wing's centre section itself, and the relatively intact empennage, minus its horizontal surfaces. The final part of the main trail consisted of a large number of fragments relating to the mid and rear sections of the fuselage and electronics bay components. The secondary trail mentioned earlier continued for a further 800 feet, climbing another 50 feet to the top of the ridge, then descending some 150 feet down the other side, crossing a public road as it did so. A considerable number of smaller, light fragments of burnt material were found in the nearby vicinity of Las Laguntas, which sits at an elevation of about 4,700 feet above sea level, on a 2-kilometre bearing of 039 degrees from the crash site. The air at point of impact and in the immediate vicinity were heavily saturated with fuel, with surrounding vegetation showing evidence of post-impact fire. Major portions of all three engines were identified. Damage to rotating assemblies and the nature of the fractures in those components indicated that all three were producing a high power output at the moment of impact. Additionally, all three thrust reversers were recovered and verified to have been in the correct stowed position for that phase of flight. It wasn't possible to determine the position of the primary flight controls with any degree of certainty. However, conclusively, it was determined that the spoilers in the wing were all in the retracted position. Likewise, determination of the position of the trailing edge flaps, leading edge slats, and Kruger flaps could not be stated categorically. However, strong evidence suggested that all were likewise in the retracted position at the moment of impact. In other words, the aircraft was still configured for high-speed flight, and supporting this viewpoint was evidence that the landing gear had been retracted at the time. It was determined by examination of the jack screw that the tailplane incident corresponded to 5 units of nose-up trim. This would have been consistent with Whelan's efforts to reorientate the pitch of the aircraft following activation of the GPWS warning. However, the possibility that this had been altered as a result of the impact could not in itself be completely ruled out. The flight deck broke up on impact, with a small portion of the recovered instrumentation, including components of the navigation, communication and radar equipment, along with both attitude indicators, colloquially known as the artificial horizons, and the aircraft's altimeters. With regard to the attitude indicators, both were recovered showing a 5-degree pitch attitude at impact and a roll angle of 33 to 35 degrees right bank. With regard to the altimeters, the slap effect of the sudden impact left residual imprint of the instrument's indicating needles on the digital selector drum, depicting an altitude of more than 5,300 feet. When Carmine failed to establish contact with 1008, he subsequently raised the alert and a standard search procedure was carried out by the Spanish Aerial Rescue Service, assisted by the Guardia Civil on the ground. As the aircraft hadn't been on its assigned course, and because of poor visibility in the area, the search lasted several hours. Numerous people using the road which runs from La Laguna to Mount Tidi in the south found pieces of aircraft wreckage, which they could not at first identify, and to which they didn't really pay much attention. They only reported the fact when they heard the news of the aircraft's disappearance on the local radio. Eventually, at approximately 2000 hours, almost 7 hours after the accident, the aircraft was finally discovered by members of the Guardia Civil, and after an initial inspection the area was immediately cordoned off. Some bodies were recovered, but due to the isolated location, nature of the terrain, and the onset of darkness, this task had to be abandoned until the following morning. During the night, various groups were organised and coordinated for recovery of the remaining bodies. That work began at 7 o'clock the following morning, April 26th, and continued throughout the 27th and 28th.
Terrain, terrain. Pull up, pull up. Terrain, terrain. Pull up, pull up.
In response to the GPWS activation, Whelan applied maximum power but significantly only applied a modest pitch-up input on the controls and rapidly reversed the aircraft's direction of roll from left to right. His response to the GPWS activation came in for some criticism from the Spanish investigators. Their investigation surmised that Captain Whelan's belief was that he was still to the north of the inland terrain. As such, subconsciously, he may well have instinctively felt that with activation of the GPWS coming as it did with commencement of the left-hand turn, a reversal back to the right may well return him to safe airspace and greater terrain separation, effectively undoing the predicament he now found himself in. Firth, with a different perspective on where the aircraft actually was, suggested that the left-hand turn be continued and tightened. Ironically, had Whelan taken his first officer's advice, or indeed done nothing at all but roll wings level and maintain his current track, in all likelihood, the collision with terrain would not have happened. Indeed, maintaining a turn at all, in the opinion of the investigators, sufficiently compromised 1008's ability to escape the rapidly closing terrain ahead. The textbook response to such a warning is to immediately apply maximum power, pitch to an attitude of about 20 degrees, and importantly roll wings level, ensuring that if the speed brakes are extended at the time, that they be retracted. To understand their concerns, it's necessary to examine briefly some basic aerodynamic principles of flight, and in particular what happens to an aircraft when it's banked in a turn. With normal, straight and level flight, the lift being produced by the wings will exactly balance the weight of the aircraft. In a turn, however, the total lift vector will be orientated out of the vertical as the aircraft banks, and as a result, not all of the lift produced will continue to support the weight of the aircraft. Indeed, the more the aircraft is banked, the less of a vertical component remains to balance the weight vector, which will remain constant throughout. This force, called the resultant vertical lift coefficient, and shown here in pale blue, thus reduces the more the aircraft banks, and the total lift vector is orientated away from the vertical. Without some correction on the part of the pilot, therefore, the magnitude of the resultant lift vector will be reduced sufficiently so as to no longer be capable of supporting the aircraft's weight, and consequently the aircraft will descend. When I talk of pilot intervention, you'll appreciate what I mean by having a brief look at the general lift equation. The lift equation is expressed as a half rho v squared SCL. It looks somewhat intimidating at first sight, but it really isn't. Think of it as a recipe, a mixture of ingredients which produce one final product, that being lift. As such, the ingredients can be manipulated, for want of a better expression, so that if we encounter a reduction in one specific ingredient of the equation, an increased compensation somewhere else will ensure that the total lift remains constant. In the case of Dan-Air 1008, as the aircraft rolled into the right-hand turn in response to the GPWS activation, the total lift vector would have been orientated out of the vertical, as in the example shown. With a significant bank angle on, as indeed was the case, the resultant vertical lift component would not have been able to support the weight of the aircraft. Thus, in order to avoid the aircraft descending, exactly what Whelan was trying to avoid, some other ingredient of the lift equation would have to be altered in order that the lift produced not only balance the aircraft's weight, but would produce a significant excess of lift, which would have resulted in the aircraft actually climbing. Rho relates to the density of the air in which the aircraft was flying, and over such a short duration of time we may consider it constant, so no potential for manipulation here. Next, v squared. This relates to the velocity of the air passing over the wing. Again, in the short time frame under discussion, there would have been no appreciable change, so again this ingredient may also be considered constant. S represents the surface area of the wing. But in the case of 1008, there was no configuration change during the manoeuvre, Thus again, the before and aft scenarios remain unchanged. This leaves the only potential for manipulation being CL. CL represents the aerodynamic characteristic of the airfoil, including the angle of attack. Thus, as the ingredient of last resort, so to speak, the angle of attack would have to be increased significantly in order to have the influential effect desired, and for this to happen, Whelan would have had to aggressively pitch the nose of the aircraft up. The truth is that whereas the procedure calls for a pitch attitude of about 20 degrees, Whelan had never exceeded 6. This simply wasn't enough. With the addition of power and the modest pitch change, all that actually happened was that their current descent rate had been reduced. Why Whelan failed to execute the recovery procedure correctly will be forever conjecture. However, it is quite plausible that as the warning silenced, he believed that the danger had passed, and as such the necessity for an aggressive pitch change had rescinded. Regardless, Spanish authorities, in attempting to quantify the effect on the neckline gradient of the aircraft, suggested that it might have been in the order of 300 to 350 feet. In other words, correct implementation of the manoeuvre may have seen the aircraft between 300 and 350 feet higher than it actually was at the point it struck the mountain. And considering the impact site was about 38 metres or 125 feet below the summit, this may have been of huge significance. The GPWS system has built-in time delays which make the exact point at which a warning is given to some extent dependent upon the rate of change of the parameters and the time for which the condition is sustained. The warning initiation point is also affected by the radio altimeter update rate and the GPWS resetting period. A single GPWS warning was registered by both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder between approximately 27 seconds and 17 seconds before impact. The indications are that the warning was initiated at approximately 1,500 feet above the terrain, following a 5-second period of sustained 6,000 feet per minute terrain closure rate. Evidence shows that the GPWS operated approximately as predicted. The circumstances which triggered the warning were altered by the aircraft passing over the ridge and the valley immediately preceding the impact zone, and thus the closure rates did not reach excessive values until a few seconds before impact. In arriving at a conclusion as to the ultimate cause of the accident, Spanish investigators made the following observation of events as they transpired on that afternoon of April 25th, 1980. It was their opinion that in view of the traffic being handled, Camille should have kept the Dan-Air flight in the holding pattern at the Tenerife North VOR, possibly not wishing to delay the flight and being convinced he knew the position of the two aircraft. Instead, though, he kept them at a vertical separation of 1,000 feet throughout. They were of the opinion that the controller did not determine correctly the position of the Dan-Air aircraft. This, they said, was evident from his failure to appreciate that it was overhauling Iberia's 711. Thus, when Dan-Air 1008 reported passing the Tenerife North VOR, perhaps earlier than he had calculated, he found himself in an unexpected situation and therefore passed information about a hold at Fox Papa. Revising his calculations, he estimated that at the theoretical speed for the sector, the aircraft would take nearly 2 minutes to reach the beacon. But it reported passing Foxtrot Papa and taking up the hold a mere 63 seconds later. He authorised the descent to 5,000 feet in the belief that the aircraft would be on the entry segment of the hold, that is, on a heading of 330 outbound from the Fox Papa, in accordance with the procedure for entering the holding pattern. Thereafter he began with the information on the hold itself, with the words, "the standard holding," which according to ICAO Document 8168 Ops, Part 2, Chapter 1, Section 1113, indicates turns to the right unless otherwise specified. Although what Kameen meant to say was turns to the left, what was actually heard was turn to the left, and this, if the information was not read back, could give rise to incorrect interpretation. It proved possible to determine by reconstruction of the flight path that after passing the Tenerife North VOR, the aircraft flew at an average speed of approximately 250 knots, higher than that advisable for this part of the approach. At the same time, the navigation was very imprecise, and more specifically the aircraft passed to the east of the Tenerife North VOR at a distance of approximately 0.79 of a nautical mile, and at no time as a result did it intercept the 255 radial from the VOR, which would have brought it to the Fox Papa. It therefore passed to the south of the Fox Papa as well, at a distance of 1.59 nautical miles. Furthermore, the crew reported passing over the Tenerife North VOR some 33 seconds after actually passing it. Kameen immediately inferred that Dan-Air 1008 should hold at the Foxtrot Papa, which was accepted by the crew without readback or any request for clarification. As a statement of fact, the crew were never certain what action to take on reaching the Fox Papa, and therefore the following hypotheses can be put forward. If they had only interpreted the first part, the standard holding over Fox Papa is inbound heading 150, then they should have turned to the right on passing the Foxtrot Papa beacon in order to take up the standard hold at Fox Papa with an inbound heading of 150. If, on the other hand, they had only taken the second part of the message, turned to the left as mandatory, one would assume they should have turned left as soon as they received the message or commenced the turn over Foxtrot Papa, instead of continuing on a heading of 263 degrees for a further 20 seconds before commencing their turn to the left. It appears that Whelan's intention, as soon as he received the information, and in spite of his having said inbound 150 earlier on, was to make a left turn to take up the standard hold at Foxtrot Papa, approaching the radio aid on a heading of 330 degrees, or simply to follow a magnetic bearing of 150 because he thought that was the information he had been given. With all the accumulated navigation errors, the activation of the GPWS led the commander to alter his flight path because he didn't know his position. The deactivation of the GPWS led him to believe that his avoiding action had been correct. Standard operating procedure for an avoidance maneuver, as we've previously said, requires the aircraft attitude to be adjusted to achieve the best rated climb, and it must be said, according to the Spanish authorities, that the commander made a mistake in not levelling the wings, with the result that instead of starting to climb, the aircraft simply reduced its rate of descent. These, the Spanish authorities believe, were the combination of events which led to the accident. In summary, therefore, the final report made the following conclusions: that the commander did not follow the correct flight path after passing the Tenerife North VOR, and did not know his exact position, particularly after passing the Foxtrot Papa beacon. Finally, in light of the reducing separation between the two aircraft and the resultant increase in workload it was causing, the approach controller should have taken the opportunity and instructed Dan-Air 1008 to hold overhead the Tenerife North VOR. They were of the opinion that since the hold overhead the Foxtrot Papa was unpublished, the information furnished by the approach controller was incomplete. Furthermore, they believed that the crew had little time to assimilate the information on the hold at Fox Papa, and although they did not understand it, they did not ask for clarification. It was deemed that the commander should have paid more attention to his navigation in order to maintain a proper safe altitude in relation to the terrain, and particularly as he was not being monitored by radar. Specifically with regard to the actions of the co-pilot, the report indicated that he did not check or query the operations being carried out by the commander as required by the company operations manual, with the result that the required cooperation between the crew did not occur. Therefore, it was their belief that the cause of the accident was that the commander, without taking account of the altitude at which he was flying, took the aircraft into an area of high terrain and thereby failed to maintain a safe height above terrain as he was required to do. Mindful of the primary cause, the following were also listed as contributing factors: the carrying out of a manoeuvre without having it clearly identified, imprecise navigation by the commander which reveals that he was disorientated, the lack of teamwork between pilot and co-pilot, the short time between the information the hold being given and the aircraft's subsequent passing of the Fox Papa beacon, and finally the fact that the hold was unpublished. Thus the following recommendations were made. Flight crews should be reminded that precise navigation and adequate vertical terrain clearance are of vital importance. When there are any doubts about the instructions provided by approach, crews must request clarification before carrying out any manoeuvre based on the information received. And finally, ICAO should clarify some ambiguities in its documentation, and more specifically in relation to the need to publish all holding circuits and to clarify exactly what a standard hold is. As the accident had occurred in the jurisdiction of Spain, established international procedures dictated that this is where responsibility for the subsequent report lay. As the aircraft, however, was registered in the UK, and in this instance the complement of passengers and crew were largely British, the British authorities would also have a secondary input into the report's ultimate findings. In this regard, although broadly agreeing with their Spanish counterparts, the British did, however, have reservations that culpability for the accident was being disproportionately levelled at the crew when compared to the involvement of air traffic control. In this context, following the publication of the Spanish report, the British raised some issues of their own. The information concerning the holding pattern at Fox Papa, they believed, which was transmitted by air traffic control, was ambiguous and contributed directly to the disorientation of the crew. The transmission by the commander that the aircraft was taking up the hold at Fox Papa was acknowledged by ATC but not queried. In the absence of an instruction to hold, this amounted to a tacit approval of the action proposed by the commander and implied that it was what ATC required. British focus here was on the fact that an instruction to hold was not specifically made by Camille, although there was a belief that this was implied with his delivery of the whole information, and undoubtedly it was obvious that this was also the crew's interpretation. That said, in the opinion of the British investigators, the phraseology used by Camille, standard holding over Fox Papa, is inbound heading 150, turn to the left, was deemed to have been so confusing and contradictory in itself as to have been a significant contributing factor in the cause of the accident. Yet, no direct reference to the language used was contained in the report's final conclusions, let alone any specific reference to its potential significance. The British also wished to highlight their interpretation of the criteria detailed in ICAO document 8168, resulting in a minimum safe altitude for the procedural entry into the unpublished holding pattern at Fox Papa of 7,000 feet, and for the pattern itself to be flown at an altitude of no lower than 6,000 feet. Neither of these two figures actually includes the recommended extra 1,000 feet applicable because of the wind effect in mountainous terrain. No evidence came to light during the investigation that prior to the accident any minimum safe altitude calculations had been carried out by a competent authority for this entry and holding pattern. In the absence of a published holding pattern at Fox Papa, it is reasonable to suppose that the crew of Dan-Air 1008 would accept an ATC clearance to descend to an altitude of 5,000 feet on the assumption that these calculations had been made. It is further evident that if ATC had not cleared the aircraft below 7,000 feet during its attempted entry into the holding pattern, this accident would not have occurred. In addition, British opinion was that the published track from the Tenerife North VOR to Foxtrot Papa was geometrically unrealistic for a high-performance aircraft like a Boeing 727. Therefore, they surmised that Whelan, mindful of the short distance between the two beacons, had deliberately flown the aircraft wide in order to better position himself for the anticipated track outbound from the Fox Papa beacon, that being 302 degrees, the same track over the ground as had been taken by the preceding Iberia 711. In closing their remarks, the British investigators commented that it was considered that if the substance of these comments had been reflected in the findings and causes, the report would have been acceptable to the United Kingdom. Thus, in so doing, they clearly demonstrated that their belief was that the Spanish final report, while focusing on the actions of the crew, was at the same time deficient in not placing equal emphasis on the actions of the air traffic controller. And so concludes the story of Dan-Air 1008, lost in the mountains of Tenerife, April 25th, 1980.